Good morning, everyone. I have two promises for you. This will be, the first promise is this will be the most boring presentation of the morning. And my second promise is I will try to make it more interesting. But I do find it interesting that we're talking about solar arrays and native vegetation, so that the original solar cell, the chloroplast on the green plants that make life on this planet possible, and then our new version of the solar cell, and that combination I find kind of interesting. So other people will be talking about the benefits of native vegetation and the plant selection and all those kind of more interesting things. I'm talking about people and contracts. So planting prairie isn't that hard, but it's not necessarily easy either. And so there's a human dynamic to this whole thing. So I'm going to try to bring some context to, especially for the solar developers in the crowd, and especially those that are coming from out of state and maybe doesn't really understand what prairie means or how to plant prairie, and then the implementation of some of that work. So one of the things is that, if you are coming from out of the region, you may have a design team that comes in. Sometimes, a convenience store a car wash chain might bring in their crowd from Nebraska or Colorado to build, soup to nuts on a facility. But so if you have people coming in from out of state, they may or may not be familiar with where to buy seeds or what it takes, planting season, even those kinds of things that may not have in other parts of the country. So depending on how your crews are set up, it will be important on how you actually put out your work for bid, et cetera. And then also, one of the things about these projects is you might be able to build a solar array in a summer or a season, but the plant guy, the people that are actually doing the plant management in McHenry County, will have to have a 5-year commitment to the property. So the concrete guys and the electricians and the grading contractors, they'll all be long gone, and the plant guy's stuck in Johnsburg for another 4.5 years. So that's something to be thinking about as you're putting your contracts together. So we're going to be talking about, contractor qualifications and some of the other standards that we're going to touch on today. Certainly the local protocols for where to buy your seed, local genotypes, all those kinds of things are very important. Depending on where your contractor's coming from, if they're local guys, there's quite a few good contractors in the upper Midwest to do prairies. But if they're coming in from out of state, they may have a little bit of a learning curve, at least how we do things. People plant seeds all over the place, not necessarily prairie, but there are some nuances to that they would have to become more familiar with. Obviously, there's some of the standard qualifications, similar experience, references, those kinds of things that people can put into their RFPs to make sure that you're getting the right contractor, not just that they're good landscape contractors, but that they actually understand some of the nuances of prairie planting. And then also some of the contractual things about having good staff on site. So we've had projects, and I put a little note at the bottom that perennial rye is not the same thing as annual rye, because we've had multiple projects through the years where they'll say, okay, let's plant annual rye. The superintendent leaves, and the laborers pick a bag off the truck, and they plant perennial rye in areas they're not supposed to, and all of a sudden now you're chasing it for years. And as silly as that sounds, it's a really pain in the neck if the wrong seed gets into the ground, and so you have to make sure that who's on the ground and who's doing the work actually understands the difference between some of those things in the business. Construction season matters. You can't plant prairie all the time. Concrete guys have windows, grading contractors have windows, the plant guys have windows also. And so your timing and your sequencing of your project, it's important that they understand when they're going to be ready for seed, because they're going to say, all right, we're going to get tidied up by Thanksgiving. It's kind of late for prairie at that point. You can certainly do a dormant seeding, but if you need cover, erosion control, those kinds of things, us on the green side need a little bit more warmth and sunshine to do some of our work. So there's some of that stuff. I mean, some of that is actually construction related, but it needs to be planned for, because on our side of the business, we sometimes get forgotten about, if you will. And so all of a sudden everyone gets their work done and says, okay, put your seed down, and it's coming on Christmas, and even the annual rye or some of the cover crops aren't going to germinate at that point. So that's an important consideration for those kinds of things. Not that dormant seeding is a bad thing, and it's kind of what Mother Nature does, but at the same time, if you're going to have bare ground, erosion control blanket, all those kinds of things do help, but it's also nice to have that all knitted together and green as you're coming into the fall and winter. And here's some customary planting seasons around here, you know, April, May, maybe into early June, and then on the back side, if you need to get the cover crop, you need at least, you know, September, October for the annual rye to germinate. The natives probably won't germinate, or hopefully don't germinate in the fall, and will lay dormant for the winter, but you still need that time. You can't just say any time before hard frost, because annual rye, even though it germinates in a couple days sometimes, you need to give it that time to be able to germinate. The seed and plant sources, there's a lot of good nurseries around these days in the upper Midwest, and a lot of good you know, guides on how to find them. The internet's perfect for doing some of those searches. The seed quality, pure live seed and all that stuff, which other people are going to talk about, but depending on how you set up your contracts, you may want to be able to see the seed before your guys put it down. If you have your own crews, maybe you trust them. If you're hiring somebody from the street, so to speak, you may want to be able to see the seed before it goes down to make sure that you're getting what you paid for. Some of the ratios and the seed mixes, which will be talked about by other folks, and also a certain amount of seed. You don't necessarily want to overseed some of these sites, but you don't want to have not enough seed that you don't have good cover. And then as a part of the contract, depending on who you've hired, you may want to have that materials inspection so that the day of the planting, you're able to see what is in those bags, and maybe even before the seed is actually mixed, you want to be able to see the bags with the names on it to make sure that you've gotten the right stuff. Vegetation height, which was obviously talked about a little bit, and we'll be talking about some more. There's some ratios of that, but as you put your specifications together, you have to be cognizant of that, because some of our wonderful prairie plants, plant people in the crowd, a cup plant, which can be 7 or 8 feet tall and about 5 feet in diameter. It's probably not appropriate for here. Wonderful pollinator plant, but obviously it would be a bad plant, so to speak, on this project. So also, depending on the touch of the contractors on the rest of the site, these are a lot of the black soil sites around here for these the solar arrays, but soil compaction above and beyond agricultural compaction is an important consideration. These are obviously a little bit less intense grading-wise compared to some other land uses, but it is still something that you want to be aware of. And then the rain and sun shadows consideration. McHenry County is developing some standards for the solar array, the plantings, and the performance standards. So we don't have them yet, but they are coming. And so as they are developed, you're going to want to make sure that in your request for proposals and in your performance standards that the county's regulations and standards will be incorporated in there. We expect that the county is going to go more of a coverage and functional base rather than a total diversity base from a planting standpoint, just to kind of keep it as a reasonable standard, but obviously any developer can go a little above and beyond that as necessary. But a good prairie is probably as important as a great prairie in these circumstances. So we don't expect that the county is going to go over the top, sort of like a wetland mitigation standard or something like that with all the full statistics, but that a good pollinator garden will suffice as adequate habitat. And there'll be some of the percent covers and those kinds of things, as opposed to full biodiversity and transects and all the things that go into that. Depending on the touch and the amount of disturbance on a solar farm, in an NPDES permit, over an acre disturbance, those kinds of things will potentially come into play. So as you're developing your planting specifications and your RFPs, you want to make sure that those contractors are aware of your NPDES requirements so that you can get out of your permit requirements as soon as possible with the cover. Soil type considerations on the types of seed that you know, if you do have black soil versus gravel versus a little wetter soils, all those kinds of things will matter. Slope and grade, as we saw in the previous presentation on some of that. This is obviously not a solar farm here, but you get the impression of, you know, the need to get things stabilized. And then also for, you know, blanket, erosion control blanket and silt fence are standard. The TRMs or turf reinforcement mats, nice products. They don't play well with prairie. So as your developers and your engineers are putting your plans together, turf reinforcement mat, unless you need it for erosion control, the density and the thickness of the blanket tends to be very restrictive to the bigger leaves of our native plants as opposed to a turf. And so they tend to suppress the development of the prairie. So you want to be judicious in your use of the TRMs as you're moving forward. Also, the one thing about the contracts is that it's very important for a developer to have their contractor tied to performance. So to have somebody come in and plant and leave, so to speak, is not going to cut it here, partially because it's one thing that you might not get what you paid for or need to have, but also McHenry County is going to expect a 5-year commitment. So you want to make sure that your contractor is aware of that. And then there are the fox guarding the hen house kind of issues, so that if you have your planting contractor doing your management and your monitoring, sometimes those monitoring reports can be a little glowing about how well things are doing. Sometimes you want a third party to come in and actually do it, just simulations or whatever. You won't necessarily want your concrete contractor doing all of the quality control testing. So no insinuation at all that anyone would cheat. However, you want to make sure that you're getting what you paid for. And we do management and monitoring and reporting ourselves. And, but at the same time, if you're not familiar with a certain contractor, first time you worked with them, sometimes a third party might help with that. And then that would be then submitted to the county. So the county will be expecting a 5-year grow-in period through performance. And so from that standpoint, you will need somebody that will be there for the long haul in one form or another. And it might not be a bad idea to have a letter of credit or a performance bond or an escrow. That the county may have a requirement for that as a part of that. So as you would go, you would draw that down as your performance comes through. So it goes without saying, you need to hire competent planting contractors, but also that it would be our recommendation that your contractor has skin in the game, in that if, you know, with like something like a performance bond or retainage, so that they have an incentive to come back, so that if you pay them all of their money by year 2, even though they're under contract for years 3, 4, and 5, sometimes it's hard to incentivize a contractor to come back if there's no money left in their contract or, you know, any reason to come back. So if you do have crews coming in from out of town, the initial plantings can be done by one party and the follow-up work can be done by another. You just have to make sure that you plan for that in your contracts, because if you do come in from out of state, that planting contractor is very likely not going to want to come back here in June, July, and August every year to do work out there. So you can get your local contractors to do some of that. You just have to be aware of that as you move forward. So I open it up for questions and comments. Any experiences people have had?
Vince, it was good that you included the reference to the Chicago Wilderness Native Plant Guide.
Yes.
Our native plant, I guess, restoration and guidelines. I just want to point out within that there are guidelines for selecting contractors. Like, how do you pick a contractor? I think there's even a list of maybe qualified contractors. And so I know you guys are part of that. PISA was part of that. I think AES and others were part of that. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I just want to kind of get a little bit more into depth. In terms of the performance criteria, you will have performance criteria like success of the native plantings as well as control of invasives. similar to some of the existing guidelines, like the Chicago Wilderness Guidelines?
Yes.
Okay.
But I didn't touch on that too much directly here because I believe that one of the other speakers is going into that more detail. But any of the RFPs that would have the management monitoring in there should have top-loaded what the expectations is through the growing period.
Okay, just a real quick follow-up. Beyond the initial planting or in the 5-year performance window, there will be a requirement that the landowner maintains that site through the duration of the project, so for 25 years typically.
Yes, I think there's probably 2 periods that are important. McHenry County will expect to grow in for performance and documentation for 5 years. The site will be maintained for 25 years. So that the formal management and monitoring, especially the monitoring and reporting, might end after year 5, but the management obligation will continue.
Yeah, just we don't have it completely written out yet, but we do expect that there will be requirement to maintain it throughout the life of the project, through decommissioning. So it's not just 5 years and forget it. There will be long-term requirements on top of that.
Just quickly, I'm wondering about fire. Nobody's addressed that yet. In terms of accidental fires, it seems like some of these, there's been no design, nobody's put up any seed lists or mixed designs yet, but I would be really concerned about areas that consist of a lot of little blue stem and side oats. Just a chance of a spark getting away or another fire getting over there, the damage that would cause. And then just, again, seed mixes. Nobody's put any examples up yet. I have questions about those. Okay.
I don't have any personal experience of fires on a solar array. I can't imagine it's necessarily good for any of the exposed wiring. The panels might be fine since they're relatively out of the flames, but flames can be obviously 10 feet tall even with short stuff, let alone the taller vegetation. But I think there's going to be another speaker on some of the maintenance issues related to there. And then I think they're also going to have seed mix discussions, which I did not touch on directly.
Yes, we have an entire other speaker that will be speaking about seed selection and so forth. And just speaking as a person who has helped with a lot of prairie burns over the years, I know we have heard from people in the past saying, oh my goodness, if there's a prairie outside my house, it's, near my house, it's dangerous, that prairie could catch on fire. You know what? We have the hardest time sometimes getting a prairie to burn. So I just want to put your mind at rest. Sometimes you really have to work at it, right? So don't worry about that. And does anyone, Colleen, did you want to mention anything about, have there ever been solar farms that have sparked a fire? Do you have any idea?
Right. We haven't, that's something that I watch for all the time, and I read like a nerd. I read all these, really fascinating solar e-newsletters every day. I haven't seen that happen, and that is part of the whole management, is when the biomass gets tall, is to do that spring mulch and have it become fertilizer. And to date, we haven't seen that happen, and there's not a lot of sparking that, the one time the spark did occur was when they were actually installing the wires to an inverter, and that was the only time. That was during installation, and there was just bare dirt.
Hi, I noticed on your calendar that you had the planting schedules.
Yes.
For the time of year, you had applications for herbicides. You had it in 2 different sections. Is there a way of avoiding that with your planting to minimize the risk of using products like Roundup and things like that?
Is there a way to avoid
using herbicides with your planting?
at all?
At all.
Well, an easy answer is yes, just don't use them. And that's where the mowing comes in, some of during the growing period. And there's, weed whacking and hand pulling and all those kinds of things. However, when all's said and done, things like Canada thistle or the new scourge around here, teasel, and when they come in, essentially herbicide, spot spraying is almost about the only way to do it, especially on a larger scale. So, and I don't want to say that herbicides are inevitable, but they're almost inevitable, quite honestly, on some of that, especially for the perennial weeds. Mowing and even some hand pulling and those kinds of things are okay, But when it comes down to some of these perennial weeds, it's the nature of the beast these days, unfortunately. So it's still, judicious use and, broadleaf versus, Roundup or grass selective, depending on what you're using. And it's usually backpack type spraying as opposed to wholesale spraying.
So is that something that you do annually, or is it like the initial planting, you have to do it to get the initial plants established and then you're good? But is that part of your 20-year annual maintenance plan?
Probably not. I mean, during that establishment period, the first 2 or 3 years, that big flush, these are all ag sites. Ironically, maybe the Roundup has been in some ways good for weeds because it kills everything. And so we have less weeds in the fields than we had 25 years ago because of the Roundup Ready corn and beans. Now they use the spray, the Roundup, that kills essentially everything, including good plants like monarch milkweeds and those kinds of things. But that flush of things like the annual weeds, we don't worry about too much because mowing's great for that. But it's those Canada thistles and the teasels and the perennials and biennials, the non-native thistles that we, once you get those established, you get good cover, and the native prairie does do well. But I can't say that you won't need herbicide at some point in the future, but it's certainly much, much less than it would be on a young prairie.
And to further negate that idea of herbicide use, if these solar farms, if they're put on farmland, if the farmland was retained there and the solar farm was not placed there, that farmland would have, sadly, quite a bit of herbicide put on it over several times during the year. Whereas the solar farms, there will be spot weeding that will need to be done, and who knows, maybe there'll be a shrub or two that would come up in the solar farm. If that happens, the maintenance person would cut that shrub, and there wouldn't be spraying of the herbicide. Instead, it would be take a paintbrush. Maybe some of you have done this or seen this before. You just take a paintbrush and you just paint the herbicide on that stem only. So there's not a spray of herbicide going into the air as a result. So I think the herbicide use will be much, much lower.
And I would say that also goes to having a good, solid contractor, good seeds, enough seeds to get that cover so that you're helping using, natural competition to help keep those weeds down. So that if you had not very much seed, not good seed, not a good contractor, you're going to be chasing weeds a lot longer than the opposite.
And Vince, I know that one thing that all of us in the county are very concerned about, we want to make sure that these solar farms end up looking like the solar farms that Colleen showed in her photos. We don't want weeds developed in these on these solar farms. So is there if people in the audience were to go to your website, do you actually have examples of requests for proposals that they could look at to develop their own requests for proposals to include things like making sure that maintenance is kept up over time and so forth?
We wouldn't have that on our webpage. I mean, there's a bunch of public documents that, like a McHenry County Conservation District or the Lake County Forest Preserve, they put out requests for proposals for different plantings. There'd be a lot of that. Dennis mentioned the Chicago Wilderness, the picture I had up there. They do have some guidelines on picking contractors and those kinds of things in there, but we wouldn't have anything necessarily on our webpage. But there's quite a bit out there these days on how to set up this they call it the special provisions for contracts that people could get some pretty good ideas.
Okay.
You move out here with this, and we're going to set up the next proposal.
Any last question then?
Vince can keep answering questions. We're just going to get the next presentation set up.
Any solar developer that heard something that you want to comment on or get clarification on?
Oh, man, it's going to
Oh, we do have one comment over here. Kim Kolner from McHenry County Planning and Development Department.
Thank you. I just want to make a quick statement to answer some of the questions from before in regards. I used to know it off the top of my head, and thankfully all the solar applications were approved by the county in January, so I haven't had that in my mind. So I looked up real quickly. It's going to be assessed by the state, so this is state legislation, at $218,000 per megawatt. Most of the applications that have come through the county are between 2 and 4 megawatts. 4 is going to kind of be their max for a co-locate by state statute. This can power approximately 250 to 300 homes. As a part of the community solar program, the state is allotted 117 megawatts through the block grant program to community solar. They've received applications for over 800 megawatts. So there's going to be quite a few that will not be selected in this first round. We are under the understanding that they might be doing up to 4 rounds. Beyond that, I don't know. The first round lottery will be chosen on April 10th, so just next week we'll know which applications within the county have been selected and start the permitting process. For unincorporated McHenry County, we've had 31 applications, 2 withdrawn, 4 denied, so 25 have been approved through McHenry County, plus many more in municipal limits. Those include a 100 megawatt utility scale project in Marengo, as well as proposals on all 3 campuses of the Huntley High School, or of the Huntley School District, as well as the Lake in the Hills Airport, among many more. A breakdown, I did a quick case study for the taxes. If on a 16-acre solar project, which would be about 2 megawatts, at a tax rate of 9.6, the taxes would be approximately $13,950. The current taxes on that exact same site right now are $5,200. This is clearly not going to be the same along all of the solar projects that get developed because tax rates change from township to township, and the current taxes may be assessed differently depending on other improvements on those sites. So just a general idea of kind of the things going on right now in McHenry County.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks so much to Vince. We so appreciate this.